Imagine being tortured to death for simply being questioned as disloyal. Groups of thugs roaming the streets and countryside paid to torture and kill anyone they basically wanted to. Well, unfortunately for those living in Russia in the mid-1500s, this was reality. Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, was a significant figure in Russian history, reigning as the first Tsar from 1547 to 1584. His rule was marked by both accomplishments and atrocities, earning him the name the Terrible. This video will explore the life, reign, and lasting impact of Ivan IV on Russia. Ivan IV was born on August 25, 1530, in Moscow, the son of Grand Prince Vasily III and Elena Glinskaya. The seeds of the dreadful human being Ivan would become were sown in his miserable childhood. His father died when Ivan was just 3 years old and his mother passed away when he was 8. The young prince then became the object of power struggles between various members of the nobility, in particular the powerful Shuisky and Bolesky families. While the royal court descended into a dangerous chaos of murder and intrigue, Ivan and his deaf-mute brother Lurie were treated no better than a couple of street urchins. There were times when Ivan and his sibling were left clothed in rags and on the verge of starvation. My brother Lurie, of blessed memory, and me they brought up like vagrants and children of the poorest, Ivan wrote in a letter to his close friend Prince Andrei Kurbsky. What have I suffered for want of garments and food? Being neglected and treated as a political football made Ivan mistrust the nobility. A mistrust would fester into blinding hatred as he grew older. When he became Tsar, his mistreatment would come back to bite the noble families of Ivan's realm in the most spectacular fashion. However, that was all in the future. Unable to take his frustrations out on his tormentors, Ivan took his anger and resentment out on animals instead, pulling the feathers out of live birds and throwing dogs and cats out of windows. At the age of 13, Ivan finally bared his teeth. The powerful Shuisky family were by this time the de facto rulers of Russia, having emerged victorious from their power struggle with the Belskys to have control over the prince. However, they had not reckoned on the boy they had ignored and abused for so many years. At a feast held in 1453, Ivan accused the most powerful of the Shuiskys, Prince Andrei, of mismanaging the country and had him arrested and put to death. Some say the unfortunate Andrei was torn apart by hungry hunting dogs, though a more credible story is that Andrei's jailers beat him to death. Full power was transferred to Ivan on his 16th birthday. 2 weeks later, he married his first wife, Anastasia. There was nothing particularly terrible about Ivan's early years on the throne. Indeed, it was a time of relative peace and progress. He introduced reforms that included an update of the penal code introduced by his grandfather, the establishment of a standing army, and the introduction of regional self-governance. Ivan also introduced the first printing presses into Russia and ordered the construction of the magnificent St. Basil's Cathedral following his conquest of the Tartar region of Kazan. There is a story that persists to this day that Ivan was so impressed with the finished cathedral that he had the architect blinded so he could never produce anything so beautiful again. There is no evidence that the blinding ever took place, but it's a testament to Ivan's reputation that many are still prepared to believe he was capable of such a vile and uncultured act. What tipped Ivan over the edge and turned him from a reasonable ruler into a full-blown tyrant were two events that both took place in 1558 and 1560. The first was the betrayal of his great friend Prince Kurbsky. The nobleman defected to the Lithuanians during Ivan's ill-fated attempt to conquer the Baltic territory of Livonia in 1558. Kurbsky took charge of the Lithuanian army and, alongside forces from Poland and Sweden, handed Russia a defeat that left Ivan beside himself with fury and more convinced than ever that his country's nobility was out to get him. The second event was the death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560. Ivan was certain that his wife had been poisoned by his enemies. While no evidence could be found of poison at the time, a 20th century examination of the Tsarina's bones uncovered unusually high levels of mercury, indicating that the paranoid young monarch might well have been right for once. Ivan's initial reaction to the death of his wife and the betrayal of his friend was to remove himself from Moscow to Alexandrov, a town located 120 kilometers northeast of the Russian capital. Here, he wrote 2 letters signaling his intention to abdicate. His council of noblemen and clergymen attempted to rule in his absence, but when this proved impossible, an envoy was sent to beg Ivan to change his mind. He did so on the proviso that he be given the right to seize the lands of those who had betrayed him and execute anyone he suspected of treason. The desperate council and clergy agreed to Ivan's demands. It was to prove a costly mistake. Ivan returned to Moscow and set about separating the country into two administrative areas. One would be ruled by the nobility and the other, named the Oprichnina, would be governed by Ivan himself in any way he saw fit. This, it turned out, involved the torture and execution of the vast majority of his political rivals and pretty much anyone else who got in his way. To police his new territory, Ivan created the Oprichniki. Dressed all in black, the Oprichniki were Ivan's personal bodyguard and enforcers who roamed the newly created territory doing the Tsar's bidding. They were given the all-clear to torture and murder anyone Ivan suspected of betrayal. A gang of paid thugs loathed and feared by everyone in the Oprichnina, the Oprichniki rode around with severed dogs' heads attached to their saddles to symbolize the sniffing out of traitors. It soon became a common sight in the towns and villages of the Oprichnina to see peasants, the middle classes, and the highborn fleeing for their lives as word spread that the Oprichniki were in the area. The Oprichniki were utterly ruthless. Anyone Ivan suspected of disloyalty was tortured and horribly put to death. Favorite execution methods included boiling alive, impalement, being roasted over an open fire, or being torn limb from limb by horses. To live in the territory ruled over by Ivan and the Oprichniki was to live in a permanent state of fear, as was amply demonstrated by the terrible fate that fell on Novgorod, Russia's second-largest city and Moscow's most powerful rival. Convinced that the city's leaders, clergy, and most prominent citizens were conspiring against him, Ivan ordered an assault on the city in 1570. Priests and monks were rounded up and beaten to death while their churches and monasteries were ransacked. Prominent merchants, officials, and noblemen were tortured and executed. Many were roasted alive on specially constructed frying pans. As these poor unfortunate people suffered slow and agonizing deaths, their wives and children fared no better. They were rounded up, tied up, and thrown in a river. Any unfortunates who tried to escape were pushed under the icy waters and drowned by soldiers armed with boat hooks, spears, and axes. Merchants lower down the social ladder were targeted by the Oprichniki, who were ordered to seize all profitable goods and destroy storehouses and shops. Anyone who attempted to resist was killed, as indeed were many who offered no resistance. The poor fared no better. The city was full of destitute peasants looking for work as a result of a series of famines that had occurred in the region over the previous few years. Along with the evicted merchants and their families, these poor souls were thrown out of the city and left to freeze and starve to death in the harsh Russian winter. All in all, the orgy of bloodshed and destruction visited on Novgorod resulted in the deaths of an estimated 12,000 of its citizens. With its administrative and religious structures destroyed, its prominent citizens executed, its commercial center a gutted shell, and most of its wealth stolen, the city was so decimated by the attack that it ceased to be Russia's second city. Most of what remained of its population fled the ruins for a better life elsewhere. It would take centuries for Novgorod to fully recover from the attack, and it would never again be a rival to Moscow. Novgorod was just one of many examples of Ivan's merciless approach to conquest. He was very much a sack the city and kill everyone in it kind of man throughout the long years of his brutal rule. The massacre of Novgorod proved to be the last moment in the sun for the hated Oprichniki. Ivan's crushing paranoia had already led him to begin to suspect its leaders of conspiring against him before the sacking of the city. And an attack on Moscow by the Tartars that the Oprichniki failed to repel convinced Ivan that they were not as loyal as they professed to be. The organization was disbanded and many of its leaders were executed in 1571. The Oprichnina region itself was abolished in 1572, after which it became an offense punishable by death even to mention the word. Ivan's constant warmongering and brutal attacks of his own population and on the clergy, nobility, and middle classes, torturing and executing of anyone he felt was against him, and raiding of the nation's wealth eventually brought the Russian economy to its knees, and things did not improve as Ivan aged and his mental health deteriorated even further. One of the last brutal acts of his reign occurred in 1581 when, upon encountering his heavily pregnant daughter-in-law in a state of undress, he beat her so severely that she miscarried. On hearing the news of the loss of his unborn child, Ivan's second son confronted his father. Ivan, who always carried a sharpened baton around which he used to beat anyone who displeased him, hit his son over the head so hard that he collapsed and died several days later. Nobody, not even his own family, was safe from Ivan the Terrible. Ivan died from a stroke while playing chess with a close friend in 1584 at the age of 53. His kingdom passed to his middle son, a feeble-minded fool called Fifer, who died childless in 1598, plunging Russia into a period of lawlessness and anarchy that came to be known as the Time of Troubles. From butchering his subjects to slaughtering the citizens of the towns and cities he conquered to the killing of his own son, Ivan was terrible in both the old and new definition of the word. He had started as a reasonable ruler, but his escalating paranoia and the deterioration of his mental health from 1558 onwards turned him into a monstrous tyrant who left death, destruction, and economic ruin in his wake. Yes, Ivan the Terrible truly was as terrible as his nickname suggests. Thanks for watching. If you watched all the way to the end and enjoyed, please consider liking and hitting that subscribe button.